Hello, my name is Debbie Boone, and I want to welcome you to my podcast, The Bend, where we explore how successful people navigated the path and emerged in a better place when life threw them an unexpected twist. It's inspired by one of my favorite sayings: the bend in the road is not the end of the road unless you fail to make the curve. These conversations will hopefully help you and inspire you to embrace your personal bend and to flourish. I hope you enjoy it, and if you need help with your own personal navigation and you're in veterinary medicine, please feel free to reach out to me at Debbie Boone 2 Manage Vets Consulting. Enjoy the bend and be inspired by our wonderful guest. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of The Bend. Now, today I have kind of a unique guest for me because she's not a consultant. She doesn't work in a practice, but Dr. Emily Lankau was in a position that probably none of us would want to be in the middle of a pandemic, and that was working for a government agency that was gathering data on all that. And that's what she does. She is a DVM with a PhD. She's experienced in public health operations, and she is a consultant skilled at getting to the heart of data and data systems to support efficient processes, evidence-based decisions, and clear communication. So she has done strategic planning, project management, quality improvement, surveillance, system and evaluation, data storytelling, which is one of my favorite parts of data. If I'm going to do data, I want to tell the story behind it. So Emily, thank you for being here today and for sharing your story with the audience, because I think it's going to be a little different than what they normally hear.
Yeah, thank you. That was a flattering introduction for sure.
Well, so I want to start out with, the question I typically ask all my veterinary friends, and how did you get into the veterinary profession? And then kind of veer off to that too, to get your PhD.
Yeah. So when I was 4 or 5, I wanted to be a veterinarian. My uncle's a veterinarian. That was the dream for a long time. And then I got to grad school and I really thought I wanted to be a therapist. So I spent a couple of years after taking an intro psych course thinking that was the route I was going to go down. And as it turns out, and there are pieces of this story that I may be releasing soon, I really wasn't at the right place to be a therapist at 22. So I ended up circling back to vet med and ended up going to school to be a wildlife ecologist. Wanted to be a wildlife vet, be out there, catching wildlife, looking at disease, understanding disease processes in the wild. And that is not how my career has gone at all, right? So we often don't go where we think we're going. But it's gone somewhere interesting. So, it's kind of circling back to a childhood dream that came back around when I was in my 20s. And it's been an interesting path, to be sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We talked a little bit on kind of our pre-interview about your story. So tell us a little bit about the curveball and how you ended up into the profession where you are, because I think a lot of times when people come out of veterinary school, the assumption is, okay, we go into clinical medicine, we're going to be a small animal, large animal, mixed animal vet. And you didn't do that.
No. So even when I was in vet school and I was working on my PhD, I knew that I was more effective at the population level. So when I got close to finishing my dual degree, I ended up applying for a fellowship at CDC to be a disease detective, an epidemic intelligence service officer, and was really privileged to get into this prestigious fellowship. And I spent 2 years at CDC, and it was like, I call it my 2 years of yes. Whatever people brought to my desk, I said, yeah, sure. Send me to Guam. We'll do an evaluation. Send me, to this place. We'll do this. I did get to use my vet skills a little. We, did some blood draws for Rocky Mountain spotted fever out west, and, did a lot of rabies work. And that's really been my bread and butter as a consultant. So that fellowship was the foundation of my consulting practice. But I hit the end of that, and that was the first curveball. The first curveball was I had lived apart from my partner for our education for years, and we hit the place where we couldn't do it anymore. So I walked out of the doors of this, prestigious fellowship that should have been the start of my career, and walked into a consulting practice with one client because I was tired and we couldn't find a way to make it balance anymore. So I set up shop in our house that was about 50 miles from CDC, but it was about a 3-hour drive in traffic. And fell into consulting. And so I did that for many, many years, 5 or 6 years. And then I came back into the public health sector at a government job that was the big curveball, sort of the one you've been referencing.
Yes.
And actually the curveball happened before the pandemic. So, public health is a tough field. It's been underfunded for years. And whenever we're successful in public health, people sort of forget about us, right? If a disease doesn't happen, they don't care. And so funding tends to fall away as we successfully control a disease. And it's a really traumatized field for that reason. It has all the stressors of healthcare and medicine and veterinary medicine, but also all the stressors of social work and education. And it's all kind of packaged up in these very poorly funded, poorly supported organizations that are trying to do 10 times more things than they have the money or staff to do. I try not to talk too much, too ill of a former employer. It was a really tough situation. It was a group of very traumatized folks that were really struggling. And that struggle came out in the form of bullying. So there was a lot of workplace bullying and overworking that was happening that took its toll. And I spent about 15 months doing that. And then I moved to another position at the agency, and that's when the PTSD hit. And after 9 months of really trying, it just became clear that the organization wasn't well positioned to support me through that kind of trauma recovery. I wasn't in a good position to recover in place. So I left the agency about 2 weeks before the pandemic hit and went back to consulting. So it's been an interesting experience of recovering from PTSD while completely disconnected from the world, while trying to build a consulting practice and find a way to reset my career. So my big bend happened right before the global bend happened, and it all kind of happened at once.
Yeah. I do want to loop back to that, because one of the things that we are seeing a lot in clinical veterinary medicine is people getting out of it because clients have been so horrendous.
Yeah.
Everybody's stressed out. It is not natural in the human experience to live in isolation. So everybody is really traumatized. The idea that an industry job is kind of nirvana for a veterinarian, I think you dispel that myth, because it really was maybe even more difficult than clinical medicine, because you were sort of trapped with a small group of people, made your life horrible.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but I think it's everywhere, right? I mean, a traumatized organization is a traumatized organization, and we see it in vet practices, we see it in government service, we see it in schools, we see it in social work. When a group of people are really mission driven and they do this redemptive work where they do it because it comes from this place of serving people and serving animals, it's really easy for the stressors of not being able to do that as well as you want to turn inward, and we kind of eat our young. Mm-hmm. We do it in vet med for sure. I've seen it, I've heard it. They do it in public health. And I think the hard part when you go through those experiences is to find a way to step back and realize, like, this is not the people, it's the system. This is a traumatized system. And this is how traumatized systems behave, right? This is how they perform, as people are so stressed and they want a solution and they want someone to blame. And often they'll pick someone out and they will all mob after that person until they leave. And then they say, oh, good, now we fixed it. But it's not fixed. So they end up targeting the next person. And for me, that was the hard part when I came through this, is I'd never seen anything quite like this. So getting to the place where I could step back and recognize that all of these people around me were responding from a place of fear and discomfort and trauma. And it wasn't about me at all. Mm-hmm. But that's not how it feels when you're in it, right? When you're in it, it feels like you are being personally destroyed. And my reputation has taken a hit professionally. I've had to rebuild. It's been hard, mm-hmm. but we go through this in vet med for sure. We see it in medicine. We see it in social work. We see it in education. We're seeing it almost everywhere right now because people are so stressed and traumatized that they're taking it out on each other. They're turning it inward.
Yes. Now, this was, we've had a conversation about the bullying in your workplace and your PTSD from it, but this is really a scary event. And so what was the scariest part of that for you? I mean, obviously you're working, you're trying to, get all this stuff accomplished. Your mission is to preserve the public health. And nobody seems to appreciate that. You're right. Until we have a problem. And then even when we have a problem, then nobody was ever doing anything right. So it was a lose-lose situation no matter what.
Yeah, there were so many scary things. I mean, I won't downplay how scary PTSD can be. I mean, what PTSD does to your brain is it turns down your ability to think clearly, your frontal lobe, your logical functions, and it turns up the little fear almond, the amygdala. And when you're living in that state, the amygdala is not a good problem solver. And the amygdala tells you, I want the pain to end. end it, right? And that's why we see folks who go through severe burnout, severe moral injury, they end up being suicidal because the fear almond in your brain doesn't do problem solving. Its only solution is play possum, stop acting, the tiger will walk away. And the way that translates to the frontal lobe is you should hurt yourself, you should kill yourself. And it's really scary when your brain is doing that. And I've gone through bouts of it for a couple of years as I recover. It was really, really scary. It's scary for your brain to be telling you this is the solution. And then the part of your brain that's still functioning saying, wait a minute, no, this is not the right solution. You know, my kid needs me, my family needs me. There are lots of people who care, but that voice from the frontal lobe can be so quiet that it's a whisper when you're really in the thick of the trauma.
Yeah.
So it was scary. I was scared thinking about my son's future without a mother. I was scared thinking about my own future. I was scared thinking about the fact that it felt like my entire narrative had been taken from me by gossip and slander and criticism. And I didn't know how to rebuild my own identity after leaving this field that I had worked in for 10 years. It was really scary. And, I think one of the scariest parts is the stigma and shame that I received when I tried to tell people this is what was happening to me. I told a couple of fairly high power people that I was experiencing suicidal ideation and they couldn't get farther away from me fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
It scared them too. And it was really dangerous because I had the support to get through it, but what if I hadn't?
Right.
What if they were the person I told and they walked away because of shame and stigma and fear? That moment, one moment in particular that I can think of scares me so much because of what it could have meant for my family if I hadn't pushed past it.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of fear.
Yeah.
It was really scary.
Yeah, I've had conversations with several friends who have been in very similar positions. And the idea that it's self-storytelling and that self-storytelling is so important. And all this fear that we are traumatized by others. And sometimes our fear is we fear to speak out because we would lose our job. We fear to speak out because somebody might, attack us back. There's retaliation possible. But a lot of times when we speak out, if we had the skills, right? If we've learned the skills to speak out, then we find out that those other people are just as traumatized as we are, and we might could work the problem together. We really might could and solve the problem. So there's so much involved in what you're talking about with fear in the brain and the self-talk that's so important. So Dr. Kimberly Pope Robinson is a friend of mine, and she talks about an incident where she had just gotten to the point where you were talking about. It was just, the world is better off without me, sitting with pills in her hand, and her dog walks by and she's like, well, who will take care of my dog if I am not here? And so that simple moment stopped her because the smart part of her brain took over and said, there's people there's beings here who matter and who I need to care for. And I know that you said the same thing to me when you thought, who will mother my son? My son cannot be in this world without a mom. And so I'm going to work the problem and work through it. And so many times in my reading, and I'm sure you're much more versed in this than I am, moment in time when people choose to take their own life happens in a very short period of time. And if something would happen to disrupt that, the moment would pass. So the idea of, in our clinical practices to keeping controlled drugs under lock and key and requiring two people to unlock the cabinet is just, it seems minor, but it's important. It's stopping that moment in time when somebody else can say to you, are you considering taking your own life? Because we're going to get you some help. The thing that you said when you said, I've talked to other people and they ran, I think that's a really important thing for us to talk about, because it makes people very uncomfortable and they don't know what to do. What would you tell people to do if somebody came to them like you came to your superiors?
I mean, I think we all need to get a little more comfortable being uncomfortable. And in vet med, I think we've made some good strides. We're seeing this now in healthcare too, after Lorna Breen's death, of talking about suicide more openly, talking about how normal this is as a response to stress and burnout and moral injury, and getting comfortable talking about suicide. Because if we talk about it, it's much less likely to happen. We know this, right? when I was in the heat of the PTSD, and so it was sort of this almost inverted attempt to save myself, I took mental health first aid through my state VMA in some weird way of like trying to help myself with this, because no one around me was comfortable talking about it. So gosh darn it, I'm going to become comfortable, right? So I took mental health first aid as part of my CE to keep my license that year. And I think really all managers and all supervisors and all clinic directors should have basic mental health first aid and suicide prevention training, just for the reasons that you said, even just to disrupt those thoughts for a minute and get someone to care and not be so afraid of it. I've heard horror stories of, someone coming to their boss at a clinic and saying, I'm feeling suicidal, I'm having trouble with alcohol, I need help, and them firing them out of concern of liability instead of getting them to the help that they need, which only makes it worse, right? It only re-traumatizes. And I had that experience at the health department. The supervisors that I worked for at the time when the PTSD hit had no idea how to handle this. And they in fact did everything wrong. And they took away my connection to others, and they tried to coercively control my symptoms for me instead of, engaging in that iterative process that's so important for the ADA. And they could have killed me. It was like I was run over by a tractor and they turned around and took the tractor back across me just to make sure I was okay, which isn't going to help anything if someone is brave enough to tell you that they're thinking about ending their life. So a lot of it is training, a lot of it is talking about it, a lot of it is destigmatizing. I am an effective professional and occasionally I have suicidal ideation. Both of these things can be true at the same time. If we can't talk about it, we can't do that disruption. We can't have that conversation. We can't make that person stop in the moment until their frontal lobe kicks in.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. We have to learn how our brain works. And you and I had a discussion about the veterinary visionaries that's happening right now. And it's an idea board. And the idea is, how can we help the mental health of our profession? How can we do it systemically so that it is not a Band-Aid here, a Band-Aid here, and a Band-Aid there, which is what we have right now. And my suggestion is that we start with making what you're talking about is mental first aid mandatory for veterinarians to continue their licenses, because we know that if you understand it, and these are brilliant people, we know that they can get the concept. If they understand communication, if they understand the neuroscience of the brain, if we reveal to them what functional MRIs tell us about how our brain works, and the triggers, then they will be able to gain control and get that self-talk going, and also being able to communicate appropriately with others in conflict rather than avoidance of conflict, because conflict truly is good. But we as humans tend to avoid it until it gets to the point where we can't anymore. And that's when we go to either silence or violence, right? So we clam up or then we blow up. And we've got to figure out a way to teach all of the professionals in our world, and I'm talking about managers, technicians, and veterinarians, how to have difficult conversations and how to move forward appropriately with curiosity rather than accusations, and rather than hiding in fear of having a difficult conversation. Because until we move forward like that, we just keep sticking Band-Aids, but we still keep cutting ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. And the silence or violence piece. I mean, my supervisors were on board with being supportive and helping me as those symptoms emerged until it scared them. And then they went stone silent and would not answer emails. They wouldn't engage in a discussion. They just went cold silent. And that silence was such an incredible tool for oppression. I mean, here's someone dealing with a mental injury that was caused by the workplace, now being ignored by a workplace. And I don't think they're an exception. I think that's generally how a lot of folks respond when somebody hits burnout or moral injury and comes and says, I'm struggling. The response is, you're a liability. We need to fire you. You're going to hurt yourself and it'll be my fault. If I stop talking to you, then I won't be responsible. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need if we're truly trauma-informed practices that value that this person on the other side of this mental health break is still worth something to society. And if I help them, they will still be worth something to us too. And that wasn't how I was treated. And it was this jarring experience of realizing how little my life mattered in the face of liability.
Yes. Well, we need to, my mantra in life is talk to lawyers less and work with your heart more. Because lawyers are always concerned about liability and lawsuits because they see the worst in humans. But if you're a veterinarian, you make a mistake, and you will go to that client and you will confess your mistake in heartfelt honesty, 99.9% of the time, that client will forgive you for being honest and listening to them. And, but if you try to hide and if you avoid and, and you're being sneaky about it, then they become really belligerent about it. Then it becomes a battle to be won because of the way you treated them. So if we learn to just treat people well, and treat them like we would be treated. I mean, that golden rule is old, but it works. There's a reason it's tried and true. Treat people like you want to be treated, even when you've made a mistake. And even if your employer said, look, we don't know what to do. We want to help, but we have no idea what to do. You tell us what we need to do. And that kind of openness and honesty. But everybody wants to have the solutions to the problem and think that particularly managers think they got to have the solution, right? Instead of asking, what is the solution? How do you need me to help you? Because I don't know. Let me go find out. I don't know.
Nope, you're absolutely right. And, especially when dealing with someone who is dealing with a mental health concern, punitive and coercive measures don't make it better. When you take away power from someone who has already had their power taken away by trauma, you double down on it, and it is so dangerous. And when we're dealing with folks in the veterinary workplace, we're dealing with trauma, right? In healthcare, in social work, in education. This isn't, unique to one profession, that when someone is struggling, asking them what they need and then doing the best you can to deliver is going to be far more effective than having conversations behind closed doors with HR and then coming down with an edict of here's how we're going to manage you because you are not doing what we want. And doing that, I mean, that honestly was it's the trauma I struggle with. I still have nightmares about having my power taken away when I already felt so powerless, when I was already so afraid. I mean, and some of that fear we know was irrational, right? It was little tiny fear almond in my head freaking out about every little thing. But they just took that fear almond and then just like poured into the bucket, right? They poured more fear in at a time when I was already so afraid. And I still have nightmares about it 2 years later. And it's, it's just it sort of goes to show you how damaging the wrong response can be when someone is traumatized.
Yes.
So we learn from it.
Then traumatizing you in the first place was that's kind of started the snowball rolling. And so, we must have some better guidelines for workplace behavior. And I think that a lot of times in government agencies, I can remember when I was in college, my roommate worked part-time for the Department of Education, and her job, and I'm telling my age when I tell you this, is that they used to have those big reels of films where they showed you like the sex ed tapes and stuff. They were really big reels. Sandra's job was because she was a technical writer, and she would look at these reels and she would write the 2-sentence synopsis that went on the metal can that these reels went in that went out to the schools. But just some of the crazy stuff that happens in government that is illogical because of budget and the way budget works, and the way that there's so much paperwork and there's so much, to me as a manager who looks for inefficiency and nonsense that you have to deal with as a government employee, that's enough to traumatize you to begin with. And to add on to that, bullying and, the other things that you had to go through, I can really see where, that would be tough for me. I am not quiet though, so I would have probably been fired very early on in the game because I would have said something inappropriate at any particular time, and sometimes that's the way it goes. Yeah.
Well, I'm not a quiet person either. I can tell you there was a lot of telling them there was a problem and writing down that there was a problem and finally leaving because there was a problem.
There's a problem and nobody.
There's a paper trail of my concerns that were my mental health is at risk. Oh crud, now my mental health is bad. But when you're working in these fear-driven, paralyzed systems, the innate knee-jerk response to someone saying there's a problem is to say, well, you're the problem. And so that was the response to most of what I brought to people, is that I was creating drama, that I was the problem. When I was coming to them and saying, I have staff members who are crying at their desk. I have people that are afraid because they feel they're being bullied. What do? I'm a manager. This is my job. And I would be told, well, ignore that and go do your job. So, that was a lot of my moral injury, as I was hiring people and bringing them into an environment where I couldn't help them or protect them.
Mhm.
And I felt personally responsible for what they were going to go through if they got picked by the folks who were targeting folks for bullying. And some of them did. And I felt pretty powerless to stop it. But it's common in government. That's the thing. Like, I don't want to point the finger at this one agency. What I experienced was worse than I've ever seen,
Mhm.
but it happens a lot of places because these are traumatized, poorly funded, poorly supported organizations that are struggling.
Mhm.
And the solution is not to blame the people, it's to fund these systems properly because they're vital to the health of our nation, and
Absolutely.
provide them the right support so that they can train their managers and not stretch their managers so thin that they can't get the support that they need to help people when they're struggling.
Mhm.
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for my manager when I had PTSD. We got no training as managers on how to cope with this. We didn't get mental health first aid training. I had worked with HR, and I can tell you they didn't provide me much support when I was dealing with an employee who was struggling. So I know she didn't get any support either. And she was being told all sorts of things that were completely inappropriate responses to trauma. I feel for her, and I suspect what happened to me damaged her too. And that damage carries forward into the next relationship and the next person she hires for the duration of her career. We're all being harmed by these systems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that really is a story that we should be aware of, is that when we don't fix the one, then it does snowball into
Yep.
becoming a toxic culture. And we sometimes wonder, well, why did this culture get to be the way it is? And sometimes it just starts with one person, and then we don't find a solution for that person, or
Yep.
we
Yep.
continue to have that person in the midst of a lot of good people, and then that just slowly poisons the entire, it's like the rotten apple in the barrel, right? It slowly poisons
Yep.
the entire barrel.
Absolutely.
If we don't solve the problem, if we don't do something about it.
Hmm.
So Emily, I mean, obviously walking away is a tough decision.
Yeah, it
How
is.
did you make that decision?
I mean, I didn't feel like I had much choice. And, they weren't communicating with me. I was in the process of trying to come back from full-time partial hospitalization mental health treatment. That's how bad it got.
Mm.
And I wasn't getting the support that I needed. And it just seemed clear that this was never going to be a healthy environment. But it was tough. And it was even tougher than I think people realized, because, I had spent almost 6 years kind of what I felt like was biding my time as a consultant until I got to a place, geographically and professionally, that I could return to public health. That's what I always wanted to do. I was a public servant at heart. And so walking away from this, I was walking away from 8 years of trying to get my life back on track after feeling mommy tracked, after having to make hard choices for my family. So it carried a weight that I don't think people really understood, because I didn't talk about that piece of my life. So it felt like I was walking away for good. And in many ways I have, right? So I left, and, while I was recovering at home and kind of trying to build a practice again so I could bring in some income and, support my family along with my husband, I went back to school, and I'm 2 years into a 3-year master's program. And at the end of which, I really am leaving public health to some extent and planning on making a big pivot to organizational trauma therapy, clinical treatment. So it's funny, I'm sort of going back to 22-year-old me from a place of a much healthier place, despite the PTSD, to be the other thing I thought I wanted to be when I was 22. It's a big pivot, and it was really hard. I had an identity crisis. I mean, I've written about a lot of this on LinkedIn. There are a couple of articles, but it was a true identity crisis. It was like a midlife crisis at 39 years old. I mean, it was a complete breakdown in my identity that I've had to kind of rebuild afterwards. So for folks who are struggling, it really is that hard sometimes. It feels like you're completely destroying yourself to save yourself.
Mm-hmm. But that's, what, going back to the fear, sometimes overcoming the fear. I mean, you have to overcome the fear to save yourself. You
Yeah.
have to overcome the fear to grow. And
Yeah.
sometimes you have to go through a really negative experience to come out the other side and appreciate where you are.
Yep.
When you're out, once you get out, looking back on it, you go, oh man, you know what? I am tough. I survived that, and I can do this. I can do this next thing. But boy, when you're in the middle of it,
Yeah.
it's not fun. Not fun at all.
It is. And, I came to the realization as part of that whole process that I'd always felt like I wasn't at the place I should be in my career because I was measuring it wrong. right? Like I come from an evaluation culture, and when you're trying to see if your programs are working, you have to measure the right metric, or it doesn't tell you if the programs are working. You see this all the time. Folks are out there, building programs, and then they're measuring this thing that has nothing to do with the actions they're taking, and then they can't make the connection to their success. And, I came up through academia. I at one point was thinking about being a professor, and the academic metrics are papers published, students trained, presentations given and invited. And there are all these hard metrics that didn't apply to my life. And yet they were, titles, right? What's your title? Are you a professor, assistant professor, associate professor? How much money do you make? These are the things I was taught to value that in no way measured what I actually was spending my time on. And I had this like huge awakening of I had a midlife crisis and kind of fell apart. And then I realized that my metrics were wrong. My decisions were fine. Like every decision I've ever made was for my family, for the people in my life, for my mentees. It was made intentionally and sometimes in ways that damaged my own career, but I did it knowing I was doing it. And then afterwards was mad at myself that my metrics didn't look right. So maybe we need to do a better job of measuring our outputs to match to our actions.
Yeah.
Because I'll never be $1 million practice owner.
No.
Not my outcome. I will never be a professor at a university with a lab of 25 students. That's not my outcome. But I was measuring based on those standards because that's success for a DVM and that's success for a PhD.
Yeah.
And I'm neither.
Well,
right?
Managers, we measure in profitability and retention. I mean, that's the other thing, profitability, retention. And so, I kind of look at that and go, yeah, okay, I was okay at that. But now as a consultant who really focuses so much on communication, I just kind of look at it. Am I making a difference? Are people getting better at communicating? Do they get the message that I've been preaching for 15 years? And I guess the only way I ever figure out that sometimes people will go, oh, what you taught me, 8 years ago is working. I'm like, oh, thank God somebody's listening and it's working. So those are the affirmations that you get, but those are not financial. Those are just doing good in the world and living your purpose. And that's sort of how I measure my success. And, I've never been a manager who looked at money. I've always looked at, were my patients taken care of? Were my clients happy? Were my staff happy? Was my business taking care of the people who worked there financially? And then was there money left over? And the answers were always yes. And so I figured I was doing a pretty good job. And that's what you should look for. It was not, intense money, nitpicking, nickel, and dime scrimping. That's not how I ever managed anything. And truthfully, I think it works out better because I don't think you can save your way into prosperity in a business. You have to grow your business and your people grow your business. So you grow your people and the business comes. And that's the way I've always looked at it. But I think this is a really good lesson, even from, in institutions, right? How do you measure your own personal success? And I don't have any kids, but I feel like I've raised a lot in practice. And I have 9 who've gone out and who've owned their own veterinary hospitals and a multitude of other ones who became technicians and successful in other careers. And I kind of feel like laying some groundwork for them to see what it looked like to work in a practice that was people oriented rather than money oriented, sent them out into the world to do the same thing and for them to have successful practices out there in the world. So that's about the best I can do with what I got to work with. And I just got to look at that. Yeah.
Well, one of my biggest measures of success recently is a fairly new mentee writes me and says, I'm struggling with my mental health, and is actually willing to talk about it. And like in that moment, like that's success, because I have often been a very closed individual. I worked in a very difficult field. I mean, wildlife health is, has its elements of sexism. It's a really tough field. It's very competitive. And so I was always very closed and I kept a lot close to my chest. And when I left that field and public health, which has some similar traits, I stopped hiding things. And, knowing that this new mentee who barely knew me felt comfortable enough saying, I'm struggling, I need help. That these days is my measure of success, that this person knew they could come and say, I need something. And even if I can't fix it all, at least they're comfortable enough to say it. Because I'll say one of my biggest downfalls, one of my biggest mistakes as a supervisor when I was in this big bad job that broke my brain, the environment was awful, fine. But as a supervisor, I was very closed off because the environment had that feeling of being really scary. It wasn't safe to be a person. So I didn't reveal a lot about myself. And that lack of vulnerability made me less effective as a leader. And it's something I knew was happening, but I didn't know how to fix it because anything I did reveal went right into the grist mill and became part of, the criticism and the sort of the churning gossip, because that was the environment. So I don't think I could have been a truly effective servant leader in that environment because I couldn't fully reveal who I was and use that as a strength. And I don't think it would have been safe to try. Right. So it's like I look back and say, wow, I wasn't the leader I wanted to be, but I don't think I could have safely been the leader I wanted to be. And if I'd recognized that sooner, I would have left sooner.
Right.
Yeah,
the point you make about psychological safety is imperative in a business and in a work environment, so that people actually do feel safe coming to you and going, you know what, I screwed up. I don't know how to do this. I haven't been trained appropriately. Help me. Because otherwise there's deception, there's hiding, there's, the mistakes are covered up. And that just leads to so much negativity. I mean, not just personal, because I don't believe that anybody goes to work going, today I'm going to go and do a really crappy job at my job. Right. I think that they want to do good work and they want to do work with a purpose. But when they are so afraid that they are going to be admonished for not knowing how to do something, or that they're struggling in that, they can't do good work. People go on lockdown. I actually had a clinic that I worked with that one of the owners was gaslighting her manager. And the manager wanted to do such a good job. Fortunately, there was another partner who was very supportive. And, I came into that clinic as a consultant and then said, this is really inappropriate behavior, because these people are so locked in fear. When they walk in this office, they don't know if they're going to be supported or torn apart. And they're constantly in the state of walking on eggshells. And when you're in that fearful state, not only can you not do your job well, you can't learn new tasks. You can't learn anything. You are so frozen. So until we learn to be accepting of people's not failures, just opportunities to learn, and not rake them over the coals for it, and even pay attention to how people learn as far as training goes. Because some people learn by reading. I always laugh and say I learned how to read a horse reading a book, but that's my learning style. But other people have to be manual. They have to hands-on stuff and be supported by, information. So I think that we need to pay attention to people. And again, going back, it's a people business. Everything is about the people and how we work together as a team. And you can never separate that. And the people who try to do that, they might be financially successful, but they're always going to be personally a failure, because they're going to be unhappy in their lives. You can't live life like that.
And I would add, it has to come from the top. I mean, I tried so hard to establish some psychological safety, and I found myself like wrapping my arms around my team and trying to hold all the bombs that were being lobbed in by the gossip and the bullying. And it was exhausting because, I was holding the line from my team, and we got to a pretty good place. They were actually pretty functional when I left, but it took, 15 months of effort. I mean, working to get folks to work collaboratively and to be open and honest with each other. And we had one of our more difficult staff left, and that helped a lot. And I mean, it was this process, but I knew the minute I let go and removed the walls, it could just all tumble, because I was the only one holding it together. And it didn't come from above me, that we treat each other with respect, that you talk to the person you're angry at, that you don't talk about them, like some of these basic principles for psychological safety. And it's one of the teams I currently work on. It's magic in a bottle. I didn't create this team. The person who hired me hired these people, and they're amazing. And they're amazing because they're so open and generous with each other and honest. And we have a philosophy of, don't break it, don't make it worse. But if you break it, please tell me, right? Like, we try really hard not to make the world a worse place. But if you screw up, you screw up. If we catch it before it goes to the client, no harm, no foul, right? And they all operate that way. And it's so beautiful to work with people who are like that, because I can trust that they're going to tell me before we send it to the client, because the rule is, don't send it to the client broken, right? As long as we fix it before it goes to the client, no one knows, no one cares. I don't care who did it. We often shake our fist in the direction of CDC and just blame CDC, because why blame someone on the team? It's not CDC's fault either. The data are tough. But I mean, it's, the human nature to want to blame someone. So
Yeah.
we've externalized that on an agency that is miles away,
Mhm.
and we focus on fixing the problem,
Yeah.
right? And it can be really beautiful, but some of that is lightning in a bottle. They just hired these amazing people. And some of that is, that we didn't have an established history of trauma that we were fighting against and like pushing back, and like trying to hold a team together with your arms. And it's such an interesting contrast, because I inherited this group of people. They weren't even a team when I started at the state. And I was handed 12 positions and told, here is your new team. And I had 2 people who wouldn't even speak to each other, who sat next to each other, and had 3 years of conflict. I don't know that I had the power in me to fix that without someone above me coming in and saying, we don't do this anymore. Here's the line. And I couldn't get anyone to do it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite books on leadership is called Tribal Leadership, and it talks about how we develop into different kind of tribes. And it sounds like you've been in level 2 and 3. Level 1 is street gang level. Level 2 is postal workers. Level 3 is those who are in power, hoard power, and they are. The attitude is, if I only had competent people to support me, I would be, even more wonderful than I already am. And that self-centeredness there. Yeah. And that's where most American businesses live, in level 3. And then we have level 4, which changes completely. And what you've just said is what triggered this conversation, is that there is a common enemy, and the enemy is them. And then we work together. We are us, right? We are us, and we fight the battle, and the common enemy is them, who is, and this is kind of how my practice was. We had a practice down the road, and they were a good practice like we were, but they would do this discount vaccine clinic one Thursday night a month. And we were just horrified with that, because we thought it was shoddy medicine for a hospital that quality. And so they became our enemy. They were, even though we were kind of friends with them, they were our enemy hospital. Yeah. And so we worked together. But then, the level 5 says that it is not about us. It is not about them. It is about what could be. Yep. Out there in the world, and we're going to solve this major problem out there, and it's beyond us. And this is kind of like, Apple and some of Amgen, who are they're just going to solve the problems of the world, and they take it beyond the walls of where they are. So we aspire to be there. Usually we'll go up to there and come back down to 4s, but it sounds like you're working in a level 4 team, which is wonderful.
I don't think you can maintain 5 forever, but 4 to 5, like flexing between those 2, I think is reasonable. Yeah. And I mean, when you're working in stressful, complex environments, like, we do reopening guidance for COVID, among other things. And so it's, it's a constantly shifting environment. Holding firm at a 4 feels pretty darn good when you're working in trauma, right? And you're processing these data every day, and you're seeing the cases accumulate and the deaths accumulate. I can't imagine what it's like at the state. I feel for my colleagues who work in public health at a public service level, because when I see the aggregate data, it breaks my heart, and they see every case, right? They're touching each individual human as they come through the system. This has been horrible for them, and the mental health fallout is still coming for public health, because we haven't really left the trauma. And my experience of this, I learned a lot about trauma because I was fine until I left the job where the trauma was happening, and within about a month I fell apart. Like, I had the walls, I was functional, I was going to work every day, I was doing my job, I was at top efficiency, until I paused for a minute, and then it all just crumbled apart, and I was completely unable to stand. So we haven't hit that yet. This outbreak hasn't ended yet. And I worry for the mental health of our public health agencies, because they've been doing this a long time.
They have. And
they're going to need us, like us as a community, as society, to support them through this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think they're getting support. I mean, it's like people have decided to not believe in science. And, as I'm a scientist, you're a scientist, our profession is full of scientists. And I struggle with people who don't get science and how it works. But it's not, I can remember hearing the head of the not the CDC, and or the World Health Organization, but he said we underestimated the knowledge of the public about how things work in science, about the scientific process. And I, as someone who sort of spends a lot of time teaching scientists to speak to non-scientific people, I completely agree with that, that they did not really understand, that people didn't understand that there's no answer. And the news had a lot to do with this too. I think I saw Denzel Washington talking to the press. They asked him a question and he said, you didn't care if it was accurate. You didn't care. All you cared about was being first, not being right. And this is where we are. So, the breaking news every 5 minutes is not truly breaking news. And you want to keep not bashing the media, but it did play such a huge part creating such misinformation that could have been supported if a better message had been put out there into the world. And I think this is where we run into problems when we have academics trying to talk to the public, and they really need to talk to PR people instead of having conversations with the public so that they actually know how to reach people at a level that they can understand. And that is our problem.
No, I agree. The value of a good risk communicator cannot be overstated. No. I mean, I'm a scientist and I have someone, luckily, when I do more public health related communications, that I filter everything through, and he has taught us well. And he has taught us the art of bridging and to simplify and to repeat points and just these key communication principles. And I don't claim I'm great at it, but I'm better at it because I have someone with that training and support. I wouldn't say I was trained to do that, right? We train PhDs and send them out into the world to say sentences that have 4 semicolons and 5 clauses. And it's taken years for me to, sort of pull it back to a place where I communicate clearly and succinctly. And some of my sentences are only 3 words long. Very good. So communication is a big piece of this. And I think you're right. It's a big piece of how we interact individually, how we deal with conflict. It really does come down to just being comfortable with having these hard discussions.
True. It's true. And asking questions, I think we have to make statements all the time. Let's just ask some more questions.
Yeah.
And then maybe we should shut up and listen to the answers. Yeah. Because we don't do that either. Yeah.
No, I could have done that better as a supervisor, but again, when you're a first-time supervisor, you have a lot of pressure on you to know what you're doing and very little training to help you do it.
Yeah, I read a stat not too long ago that said 51% of people who are in management positions have had no training on how to lead or manage.
Yeah.
They were just good at what they were doing before and they got promoted. And that happens a lot in vet med. That's a great technician, a great receptionist. Oh, now here, run my hospital. I'm not going to teach you how to do it. And I'm going to hold you accountable if you don't do it well. So there you go. So it's all about teaching people how to do their job. And it's a challenging job. And if you don't do it well as a manager, you're right. It all falls downhill because it does come from the leadership, and it does. So Emily, looking back on all this, what do you consider to be your biggest career mistake? Was it not following through at 22?
I don't know. Yeah. So you sent these questions in advance and I stared at this one for a while. I mean, we've talked a little about the metrics. I think I've measured success wrong for a long time, so didn't really understand my own place in the world. And I think I felt like I had to live up to someone else's standards. And so I kind of had these blinders on, like, here's the goal. I'm going to get back into public service because that was the goal. And I may have missed opportunities along the way. And I also may have overlooked red flags when taking an opportunity to get back into that set me up for failure and set me up for a really dangerous, health crisis. And so I think that's that blinders, right? It's that single focus. And I see students doing this all the time where they say, I want to work in this area, in this field. I want my internship here. And it's really hard to pull them back and say, transferable skills are transferable skills. I am a wildlife veterinarian. And right now I am training to be a trauma therapist, right? Like you can make these moves. And I think that comes with age and wisdom and experience, unfortunately, to see that sometimes what you think you want for yourself, it's just not working. And if you have these blinders on, I took a job with red flags. I knew I was walking into trouble. And I had that like hubris of the young, even though I wasn't that young when I did it, but I had this hubris that like, I'm a high achiever. I've always succeeded. I'm going to go in and I'm going to fix this and it's all going to be okay. And then I burned myself to the ground and almost died, which is not the outcome we were going for, but it is the outcome that I got. And, I think I take responsibility for that, that I was just so focused in on getting back into my career and getting back off the mommy track that I didn't heed the warnings. And I set myself up for a really dangerous situation that could have been my undoing. And that's on me. It's on them that the environment was so awful that I could have died. That also is true. But I think maybe, learning to have a broader view of the world and my place in it at an earlier age would have made things easier. It might not have changed any of the decisions. It just would have felt better.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what a great point that is, that because I think about veterinarians particularly, and I was one of those, I wanted to be a veterinarian from the time I could remember. And that was the entire focus of my education. And when I went to apply for college, I applied for one college. My mom was like, what if you don't get in? I went, I'm getting in. And I did, fortunately. So I went to NC State and my goal was to be in their first class. Well, they didn't build the school fast enough. And then after that, after 4 years, I thought, I don't really want to do this anymore. I really am tired of education. I don't want to do this anymore. Moving out and doing other things. And the thing I do regret is not having more jobs. Because I think that once you get a taste of a lot of jobs, you really see what you like, what you don't like.
Yeah.
I worked a little bit as a volunteer in a veterinary hospital. I grew up, my family owned restaurants, so I didn't have a choice about where I was going to work my whole high school and college career. But I really wish that I had gone out and worked in maybe a retail shop or, something else. And I've never worked in a corporate, like a big corporate group, which I actually think is okay because I think I would go crazy there because of the things you talk about. But I would have liked to have had at least some of that experience to bring to the table in my decision making. So I think variety is a good thing, and getting out into the world and meeting a lot of diverse kind of people, because that truly was helpful to me growing up in the restaurant business because we fed everybody. And I grew up in a crowd, and that is extremely helpful in, helping you get through life, working with all different kinds of people at all levels of education, and help me understand, how to communicate with people all across the board. So let's talk about what you're doing now, because I think this is interesting. You are gathering data and about COVID cases, right?
I do a couple of things. So I have a consulting practice and I work for a couple of different groups, and it's all sort of data related. So, at the moment I call myself a public health operations consultant, but really I do an awful lot of sort of how to use data in a way that is more effective or helps you make good decisions. So I do a little bit of COVID reopening guidance for some clients. I just started working on some chronic disease data systems improvements. So it's all kind of about quality improvement and using data to make good choices in the world. And I don't know how long I'll be doing that. If people ask her, what's your trajectory? And I have no idea. I have 1 year left in school. I am a student at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville in their social work program, doing a trauma certificate with a clinical focus. And at the end of that, I may fully segue over into clinical practice. I may kind of do a half and half. I have no idea. This is new, right? I am Little Miss Type A, had the whole life mapped out, did 8 years of dual degree because I knew I wanted both degrees eventually. And I have no idea where I'm going. I mean, I am quite literally on the curve, like clinging to the edge of the road, trying to make the pivot. And I have about a year left in training for that. And I have no idea where it's going. It's, it was what drew me to social work, I think, was this whole experience, but especially the part where when I was going through the worst of it, and I would have people say to me, well, but are you taking care of yourself? Self-care is important. We need you to be resilient. And that, coming to this place of understanding of like, no, I was so resilient that I resilienced my way into a mental health crisis. We need to fix these systems. We need to come at trauma from a different place. So I'm probably going to end up doing some organizational trauma work and change management sometime down the road. But as my husband says, don't be Batman. So right now I'm focusing on the individual. I'm focusing on clinical practice because Batman's always trying to resolve the conflict he feels in the world. because his parents were killed, and that's the origin story. And I don't think I want to be Batman. I don't want to go out and have my new career and my pivot take me in a direction out of pain. Mm-hmm. So, right now I'm focusing on clinical practice and kind of building myself back into someone that can handle the pressures of trying to fix systems. But I can't tell you when I'm going to be there. Yeah. I want to be there when I'm Superman, and I'm doing it because I can, not because it comes from a place of deep hurt.
Yes. I love it. I love it. So, as a consultant, I mean, is there a value in networking? And because I always ask this question, because networking in achieving your new goals, how will you put that into play?
Yeah. So as we've discussed, in my former life, pre-trauma, I was a fairly closed off person. I'm very shy, even though you would not pick it up here, sort of tend to be a really quiet, reserved kind of person. I had no social media accounts. My business and social network were like this big, right? I mean, just a few people. It was really small. And part of this recovery, when you've had your identity destroyed by gossip and bullying, trying to find a way to rebuild who you are and like sort of exert yourself into the world is tough. And it's even tougher in the middle of a pandemic. So I ended up on LinkedIn, even though I'm not a social media person, and just started writing and connecting and finding all of these interesting people, many of which have been on your show, and just trying to reattach myself to a community. So it wasn't about my career. It wasn't about making this pivot. It was purely about like existing when people told me you don't get to exist anymore. And in the process, it's become this sort of beautiful community of people that I engage with on a kind of daily basis. We tell a lot of jokes. I know you're part of some of the pun circuits.
The puns, every Friday we do Matt Solei's puns.
Right, right. And it wasn't about my career. It was about exerting my will to be in this world again. And in the process, I picked up some clients. I mean, it sort of beautifully evolved into this nice group of people. And there's some, new opportunities on the horizon that, again, have come out of just existing honestly in a space. I never would have expected social media to do that. I'm still a huge social media skeptic. And it's not that there's not a lot of, misinformation and garbage on social media, LinkedIn included, but there's also this really interesting community of people who I think legitimately care about each other and end up getting together in person and, collaborating and working together. That was a huge part of my recovery. Like, I exist in this world because I could exist in this virtual world while sitting safely in my house while we figured out how to keep people from getting sick. Never would have guessed that's how this was going to go.
Yeah, that's that's a fascinating thing. And for me, I think I started working, just doing LinkedIn. Like, I don't know why I started to do it. I think I just did it when I started my consulting business, and I was just connecting with people that I had known in the profession. And, I think for one thing, I had a lot of sales reps that I connected with that had called on me for years and years at the animal hospital. So I was just trying to find those people again and stay connected with them. And, as I grew, they grew. And as they grew, they started to hire me into things that, they were projects they were working on or to help their clients. And so it did end up being a source of revenue for me. But like you, it is community for me. It is a group of people that I find very interesting. And I like to, I mean, I met you because I read something that you wrote and I went, ooh, I really want to talk to her because she's written this very interesting thing. And, you were gracious enough to connect to some crazy woman who out of the blue said, hey, let's just have a conversation.
You're not the first. I mean, I have talked with people all around the globe. I mean, I have become this global citizen while sitting in my kitchen. I mean, my life is so much bigger than it was before the trauma. And they talk about this, right? Like traumatic growth. And I wouldn't claim I'm there yet. I am still very much healing. But you can see the potential, right? When you have a call with someone in the Ukraine or have a call with someone in the UK, or you talk to this really cool nurse in Australia who's trying to like deal with burnout in the healthcare system. And it just makes your world so much bigger while sitting in your kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is one of the blessings of social media. And it's how it's used appropriately. And, rather than this chest beating opinion bashing others, then to truly have deep conversations with people and be very interested. and what other people have to say about the world, rather than it's not all about you. And I find a lot of social media is look at me, look at me. But I much rather talk to you,
Yeah.
in it. And then, and that way it's helpful. Otherwise can be as traumatizing as any bad workplace.
Absolutely.
Well, Emily, what advice would you give somebody who's facing these difficult career decisions? They're in a place that's toxic or just damaging to them.
Yeah, I hate giving advice. I mean, everybody's situation is different, but there really are some common themes where advice, might help. So I will do my best. I think the hardest part of all of this for me was, and still is, forgiving myself for not seeing the bend coming, right? So when you're in the thick of it, you're just so mad at yourself for not seeing it until it's so too late that you're like careening off the side of the road and grabbing the guardrail and trying to redirect. And I think that's unfortunately how life works. Very few people are clairvoyant enough to see the bend coming and like stop and slow down and take a clean right turn. So I think finding a place of forgiveness for yourself for not seeing it coming and for having to go through this hard thing that you feel like you should have prevented. As they say in therapy, don't should all over yourself, because if you could have seen it coming, it would not be a bend, right? You would have slowed down and avoided it. So I think that's one piece. And so for folks going through these kind of forced, unexpected changes, just to be very forgiving with yourself that you didn't see it coming and you couldn't have stopped it. I've had an easier time forgiving my bullies than forgiving myself. I mean, that's how bad this is, sort of taking on that I should have seen it, I should have prevented it, I should have protected my family. But all those shoulds have not been helpful, and I still feel them, I still think them, and I guess the other piece of it is getting past the shame that things aren't the way you think they should be, so you can connect with others, because connection is the guardrail that keeps us on the road as we make these big turns. And so often our response to trauma is to curl inward, right? And to like get as small as possible and not want people to know that we're hurting and not want people to know that we're struggling. And if I hadn't had this incredibly huge community of people who are just like, oh yeah, it happened to me too. This is awful. I wouldn't have had a guardrail, and I would have been like, like when Wile E. Coyote goes running off the edge and tries to make the turn, and then he runs in place and he falls off the cliff. Like, people and connection and stories are the guardrail that keeps us safe during these big, big transitions. And too often, I think we pull away because we don't want anyone to know. And that's dangerous, right? Yes. You're going to run right off the cliff instead of making the curve.
Yeah. I think teaching people that it's okay to be vulnerable.
Yeah, it's hard.
Because the vulnerability of others lets people come to you, because you're right. It's like, that happened to me too. Yeah. But until we say, oh, this happened to me, then others can't come to you and go, how did you get through it? Because I need a tour guide to get me through what you've been through. And that happened to me too. And then we can help others. But the vulnerability has to come, and we have to be able to, I laugh and say, confess your sins. Because when I was managing, I tell people I screwed up. I mean, here I am, I'm the management guru out here in the world, but I screwed up. And it's okay to tell people that you screwed up. And it's okay to tell the people that work for you that you screwed up, and ask them to help you get through whatever it is that you did. And so when you confess your sins, then other people say, yep, you know what, I sinned the same way, and I got through it like this, and you'll get through it too. And it's good to have company, to walk you through around those bends in the road. And I love how you use the analogy of the bend, because it's so true. It's absolutely true. If we could see it coming, we wouldn't go there. But we can't see it coming, and we never will, because that's life. Life just throws shit at you. It just does.
It does.
It does. Yeah. So tell us a fun fact about you. Do you have a secret talent? Do you have a favorite song? Something that people would be surprised about?
I mean, it is no surprise because it's on my LinkedIn profile. But when about 2 months into the PTSD, so I played instruments in my past, never a stringed instrument. And one day out at brunch with my family, I had an impulsive decision to go buy a ukulele. And, traumatized people are super impulsive. So my family's been through a lot. This was probably the worst. My son hates the ukulele with a passion. But I just went and bought a ukulele and like started teaching myself how to play. My goal was to play Everybody Hurts by REM, which at the time felt like wonderfully ironic as I went through this horrible thing. And so I play almost every day now, and I wouldn't claim I'm good, but I would claim that I complete songs from the beginning to the end. And actually what was really interesting is, maybe a year ago, I was listening to, I think it was Brene Brown, one of her podcasts, and she had on some authors who had written a book on burnout. And, so they went through the list of things you can do to protect yourself from burnout or recover from burnout. And creativity is one of those. And like the brain gravitates to the things that heal it. And I had no idea this is what I was doing at the time. I was just impulsively buying a ukulele because traumatized people are impulsive. But I was actually healing myself, the vibration and the concentration and the new skills and the like distracting my brain from the things that hurt and the flashbacks. It played a huge part in my recovery. And now I play the ukulele. So that's cool.
That's really cool.
Right?
That's really cool. When I was managing, I laugh because I think everybody has a side gig. But when I was managing, I would paint. And that was kind of my escape from the, the challenges of work. I would just go sit in my garage and paint for a couple of hours. And I painted pet portraits and nice. Portraits of children. And it does just completely take you away, and it takes the other part of your brain out to, it kind of airs out the creative part of your brain. And it does help balance, how you look at situations. And truthfully, management and work is creative. And when you're looking at work, if you are engaging both sides of your brain, then you're bringing your whole self to the job rather than just, I'm checking off the box, to get through this. But creative management is, the best way to do it. Put all the brain to work, both sides of it. Okay. Any final words of wisdom, anything that you want to share, like a favorite book or a favorite quote or a shout out to a particular person that, has helped you move through your challenges?
Yeah. So two things, for folks who are listening, please connect if you need something, because connection is the guardrail, right? It's if you're going through this, if I can't help you, someone in my network probably can. So we'll just put the plea out to folks that it's okay to reach out through LinkedIn. And I think gratitude. I mean, I think it's another big piece of my recovery. And I do this openly on LinkedIn, and it all feels real weird to me as a non-social media person, but I am so grateful. Lots of people walked away when I was broken and have treated me like I will never be well again. And that was hard. And you learn really quickly who your friends are, and you learn a lot about other people. But I am so incredibly grateful for the people who have stuck it out, and for the clients that have hired me with what I have on the web. They know what they're getting, or they didn't do their due diligence. But I think all my clients actually do know. They've read these things and they know what they're getting. And just the comfort that comes with being able to be grateful for all these people who can see you warts and all and are totally fine with it. I mean, it's a whole new way for me to exist. I mean, my heart doors are wide open, and if you don't like it, don't hire me. Don't be my friend. Don't reach out to me, because I'm tired of having to hide behind what I'm supposed to be, what I should be in this world. So in many ways, I'm grateful for the trauma, even though it was horrendous. I mean, it was shitty, and I'm not through it yet. I have days where it's awful and it's hard and I am down in that muck again. But I'm also grateful that these folks that attacked me made me just completely walk away from trying to hide the things that they were going after. You can't shame someone who's wide open. And that is the gift of trauma. When you really come through trauma, it's all out there. So you can't shame me anymore. You can't make me feel bad. You can't tell me I'm not good enough, because it's all out there. And I'm grateful for that, because I don't have to be the person that I was told I'm supposed to be and measure myself by those metrics of papers published and number of presentations and how much money I make, or my title. I made up my title. I could have been CEO. I chose not to be. So I'm grateful. And I think gratitude is a big part of this journey. When you come through these horrible experiences of looking back periodically and saying, oh yeah, that person was standing there and they like grabbed my arm and yanked me around this curve. I'm grateful for that. So I am grateful for the community that I found on social media, as weird as it was. I'm grateful for people like you who just randomly reach out and connect with folks. And so I'm offering that to others too, if I can be that for you as you go through your thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful that you made the offer, and grateful that you said yes to being on the podcast, because you said, oh my God, this is going to make me nervous. But
absolutely.
Hopefully it was painless. um, at least as painless as it could be, because you shared, a very difficult story. And I think that's an important thing for people to listen to. And I hope that, somewhere out there in the world that we saved a life today. And I think we probably can. We can do that.
It's a good day if you may have saved a life today. I'll take it.
Exactly.
That's
So
a good
thank
metric.
you. Thank you again, Emily, for being on The Bend. And we will have all your information about your consulting business and how to get in touch with you on LinkedIn in the show notes, so that people who do want to reach out absolutely can. And I look forward to staying in touch and seeing what happens when you reach your next bend in the road. And hopefully it's going to be the positive one that out there and get your social work degree. And then we'll talk again, because I think there's so much room in veterinary medicine for what you have to offer. Then we want to make sure people know about it.
Thank you.